Good morning. We are beginning now our workshop on fuzzy poverty. It's organized by our Research Center of Inequality and Development, SED, and I need to thank the support by the coordination of our PhD program, and also Professor Humberto of the research coordination of the university. I thank, of course, Professor Beth and especially Professor Shorrocks for having accepted our invitation. And now I will pass for Professor Alberto Di Sabato, the director of the Economic School, to say some words to you.
Na pessoa da professora Renata Del Vecchio, já de longa data, uma parceria mais recente com a Universidade de Siena, aqui representada pelo professor Gianni Betti, e as boas-vindas ao professor Anthony Shorrocks. E acredito que a universidade ela se mantém viva, atuante e se enriquece justamente com esse tipo de parceria interinstitucional e, sobretudo, internacional. Então, as boas-vindas, um bom trabalho. Infelizmente, eu não vou poder participar do seminário, pelo que peço desculpas antecipadamente e desejo a todos um bom trabalho durante o dia de hoje. Muito obrigado.
Now I pass to Celia that will coordinate this session at morning.
Well, thank you very much for everyone for being here with us and for giving us an opportunity and also a will to develop more activities like this. And I'd like to especially thank Professor Gianni Betti and Francesca Betti too. Betti. She's also a statistician. Next time we will invite her too. And Professor Anthony Shorrocks for coming from so far away from Finland, especially to present, to give a speech here today. And he will come back to Europe this night. So he has been staying for only 2 days in Brazil, which is an honor for us. I would like to say a few words about our first speaker, Professor Anthony Shorrocks. He's now the director of the United Nations University wider program, which is the World Institution of Development Economics Research of the United Nations. Professor Shorrocks has taught in many different universities, and he has groundbreaking work on methods for measuring and analyzing inequality, poverty, income, mobility, and living standards. Most recently, he has finished a very important and groundbreaking work again on measuring global wealth inequality. And besides being a very important work, this work is freely downloadable in the internet, which is something to be very much welcome. So without further delay, I'll pass the word to Professor.
First, thank you for the invitation. It's not my first time in Rio. I've been here a couple of times before, but it's always nice to come back, except every time I come back it seems that the weather is not as advertised, but I'll have to keep coming back until I get the weather to improve. Just to give you some background, because mentioned, I'm directing a United Nations Institute. It's a rather unique, rather unusual institution. We try to do work which is linked to the interests objectives of the United Nations. And we're focusing on development economics. It's in Finland. You might ask why Finland? Well, it just happened. It's one of these historical quirks. But we do a lot of work, and we try to involve people from all over the world. In fact, just less than 2 weeks ago we had a major conference on what we call Frontiers of Poverty Analysis, and we had people from all over the world participating in that. So if you're not already familiar with WIDER, I suggest you look at the website and get on our mailing list, because we regularly We very much encourage people from all over the world to participate in our activities. And we do quite a lot with Brazil. In fact, in the last I think 3 or 4 years, we've had 2 meetings in Rio. One just a few months ago, and one about 3 years ago. So we have meetings in Latin America and historically quite often in Brazil. We're very interested in trying to connect with people all over the world who are doing interesting work. I thought today I was asked to talk about fuzzy poverty. I'm not sure whether what I'm going to talk about is exactly what other people have in mind, but I thought I would take the opportunity to, if you like, give the background and to talk about all the elements of fuzziness in a very general way, all the aspects where we have uncertainties creeping into our analysis of poverty. And I'm going to do this, if you like, from a historical perspective as well. Anyone who is an expert on poverty is probably going to get very bored, but assuming that you're not all completely familiar with it, I hope you'll find something of interest. So, let's see. I think it's quite useful to begin by referring to Amartya Sen's distinction. He made a very important distinction between splitting poverty analysis into 2 stages. The first he referred to as the identification stage, or solving the identification problem. And this is essentially saying, how do we determine who is poor and who is not poor? What is the background for making that decision? The second stage in his framework was what he called the aggregation problem. Having made that decision, how do we construct some overall index of poverty for society? And I'm going to talk about both those stages, but I think it's also, there's a sort of neglected intermediate stage, which I think of as a sort of comparability problem. That very often we solve the identification problem for some specified type of household or individual, but then we also have to worry about how we extend that definition to different sorts of households over time, different household circumstances, different places in which they live. So the identification problem is rather broader than simply the sort of way in which I think he initially framed that. So I'm going to talk about all of these things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how historically certainly the problem of the conception of poverty has changed. And again, if one looks back and sees what was the first attempts to try to tackle the question about measuring poverty in a quantitative way, the earliest ideas were really associated with what people now often call basic needs. And the idea here is that someone is poor if they have resources. People typically use the term income, but in fact consumption or expenditure is probably a more accurate term here. We have some notion of subsistence level, and if people have resources which fall below that subsistence level, they're judged to be poor. So this is the basic needs idea. I suppose around the 1960s, there was a move away from basic needs, which is now often associated with some sort of absolute measure of poverty, absolute notion of poverty, to the notion that people were poor if they were not just absolutely, didn't have these basic subsistence level, but if they were poor relative to the society in which they live. So people and then this term relative deprivation, relative poverty became quite well discussed. So this idea is individuals don't need to be below some subsistence level, but they may have a low level of resources compared to other people in their society. Then I guess about in the 1970s there was a move quite associated in particular with Peter Townsend, who's a sociologist, to to switch to the notion of social exclusion. And here the idea is that people are poor if they're unable to participate fully in the sort of normal activities of a society, in the sort of things that people are expected to do and typically take for granted. If some people can't do it, then they are deprived, and they are excluded from various sort of social activities. And then, I suppose, in the mid-80s, the trend now has been to switch towards, at least amongst economists, to switch towards some sort of idea of capabilities. This is Amartya Sen's contribution. And here, again, precise definition is perhaps difficult to tie down, but it's to do with the way that people achieve or function as individuals, and if they have constrained opportunities, then if their opportunities are very constrained, then they are regarded as being poor. So, again, those who are familiar with Amartya Sen's work will know the term functionings is what people do. Capabilities are opportunities for functionings, and people are poor if they have their set of possibilities is quite small. So we've seen all this, and when I say why I'm thinking this is of interest to fuzzy poverty is because all of these are somewhat vague already, and there's lots of possibilities. So let's just go through, perhaps, how people have tackled proceeded in each of these directions. The first person really to do a very systematic study of poverty was Rowntree. And again, if you're not familiar with his work, I think it's always interesting to see how the first people tackled this particular problem. But what Rowntree did is, in fact, not that dissimilar to what is done in many countries still today. He went along to a nutritionist and asked how much people need in terms of their calories to function each day. He then constructed a diet, a menu for each meal during the week, which was consistent with these nutritional requirements. He then worked out how much that diet cost and added on some non-food items in order to get a minimum income expenditure for individuals. What, of course, is quite interesting in this, and I say it's still done nowadays. I did a study for Chile 10 years ago, and indeed it looked like what they were doing in Chile was very similar, and I understand it's quite common that CEPAL do this for all Latin American countries. Essentially there's a basket of goods which you think is consistent with giving people a minimum amount of nutrition, and that this is then costed, and in the case of Latin America they usually just double I believe, this food basket to get some idea of what is the minimum income that households need. So this is, again, it's not just in Latin America, all around the world, there's a sense in which this is done. Even indeed, there's variations on this, and if you take each of these stages and ask yourself, is this a clear-cut, objective way of determining whether someone's poor or not, you could see immediately, I think, that each of these stages involves some uncertainties, ambiguities. We're not sure, for example, what nutritional needs are. Are we talking about a male that's doing a very demanding physical work, digging up roads, or is it someone who's sitting in an office all day? Is it a young person, old person? We don't, depending on their metabolisms, they may have different requirements. So the nutritional needs is open, is subject to quite a large variation there. The diet, or what do we say? Are we talking about the minimum cost or the cheapest way of satisfying this diet? Which could, of course, be a very boring diet. It might maybe just vegetables, there wouldn't be any meat in this diet if we wanted the cheapest way of fulfilling nutritional requirements. And particularly then, what are these additional elements on top of food? How much what do we require of people? Do we allow them to buy a newspaper? Do we allow them to wash their clothes? Do we allow them to heat their houses? Do we allow them to go out and have an occasional drink? There's all sorts of things there that we just are not very clear. What is done in some other countries is, in fact, to at least take the expenditure pattern as represented by what people typically do in that society. This has been the US poverty line, the so-called Orshansky Index, is very much along these lines. There's essentially a nutritional requirement right at the base of it, but they look at what American families typically, how they spend their money, and ask themselves what expenditure is needed in order to achieve this nutritional standard. And of course, in somewhere like America, where people very often buy their food in, say, fast food restaurants, that would be recognized in the American way of constructing a poverty line. They would allow for the fact, or recognize the fact, that people, are we wanting some people to come in? So they would allow people to adjust to the ways in which people live in that society. So that's the, say, traditional way, which is still widely used when one's trying to get some notion of absolute poverty. If we move on and again try to now to look at how people have interpreted the relative deprivation idea, there what they've done is often taken some proportion, some percentage of average living standards in that society. You'll find that they might use, say, half the median income or half the median expenditure as their notion of the poverty line, and if people fall below that, they're judged to be poor. This again, I mentioned here, that this is a unidimensional concept. We're talking about here a one-dimension measure of resources, and you can now still talk about a poverty line as being the cut-off between the poor and the non-poor groups. The other way in which I think was tied up with relative deprivation notions is that there began a sense in which people were asked their opinions. They started to have self-reported indicators of poverty status. Of course, it's not, one of the problems there is that you can't just go to people and say, are you poor? I mean, people would really find that quite offensive. So in surveys, there is some way of negotiating that problem. They might ask you a question like, as has been done certainly in UK surveys that I know about, people are asked questions like, do you find it difficult to make ends meet, which means, do you find it difficult to live on your income? But of course, one of the problems with when you ask that question is it's not always the poor people that say they find it difficult. You also find people that ought not to be, that ought to look like they're quite rich, saying, I find it difficult because my son's in private school and I've got to pay for their university education, and I've got to take these people to the best restaurants, and we've got to have a holiday in the Caribbean twice a year, and I'm finding it very difficult to do these things on my income. But of course, it's missing the point here. So it's quite tough to get a question, and various surveys try to get around this problem. But clearly, this is also getting close to the note to what you want. We're trying to ask people whether or not they feel, relative deprivation is to some extent feelings, and we're asking people whether they feel that they are in the poverty group. We're trying to extract some information about that. The other ways in which I mentioned at the end, I've merged these together, the social exclusion and the capabilities, because in some respects it's sometimes quite difficult to distinguish these two approaches. What is, I think, characteristic of them is that they're almost always multi-dimensional. I can't even think of examples where someone has done a social exclusion or a capability exercise that's not multi-dimensional. So we're looking at different indicators that reflect on social exclusion or capabilities. And the different indicators can be of two sorts. One is objective characteristics, so we ask questions about what people do, and also, to some extent, their particular circumstances, and we try and compare those to what is expected in that society. And also questions about subjective assessments. So we might, for example, ask what people feel about their health. In something like health status, which would be very much, it certainly is a core element of the capabilities approach, we might ask ourselves objective ways of measuring someone's health, and also what their feelings are. What is your own assessment of your health status? Do you find it difficult to walk up and down the stairs? These sort of things. So, having looked at all these, putting all these together, we can see that we have a huge variety of different ways of assessing poverty status. And that this is, when I say that the fuzziness or vagueness about this, it is very much evident in all these alternative methods. And the fact that these alternative methods coexist, even at the current time. So we have, if we try and ask, I think it's worthwhile breaking it down and say, let's suppose we just now try to do it on one-dimensional analysis. What sort of ways in which could we construct a poverty line which divides the population into the poor and the not poor? We can do it by looking at the data on household expenditures, various household characteristics, so we can look at household needs in terms of their particular circumstances, the number of family members, etc., etc. We can do it in terms of the resources that are available to them. We can do it in terms of relative income position, construct some resource measure, see how it compares with the average in that society. We can use self-reported status. The other way in which people have constructed a poverty line is to sometimes use the minimum level of state benefits. If you look at different countries, for example, the UK doesn't have an official poverty line like the US does. The UK doesn't have an official poverty line, but researchers tend to take the minimum level of state benefits as the effective poverty line. So if there's a minimum welfare payment, it's judged to be some indicator that this is the minimum resources that people are expected to have in that society. But essentially, yes, it's the minimum welfare standard. So it's the amount that people have no other sources of income and they go and get a state benefit. That is what they would get. It's very close also to the pension level. So these two things are tied together. In the UK, there's traditionally been housing is taken out of this equation. So usually the state benefit, this minimum poverty line is framed in terms of expenditures on items other than housing. Are we just very, very noisy?
Yeah.
So now you might, of course, in any one society, people might use more than one of these methods to come up with a poverty line, and you get a range of values. But I think what is quite striking is that often the numbers that you get from alternative methods are not that dissimilar. And my feeling is that, in some sense, that there's a sense in which people have to come up with a credible number. In other words, there's no point in just thinking up and just saying, I've decided this poverty line. If it's particularly high, then people would just throw it out and say that's too high. If it's very, very low, then people might reject that as well. So there's a sort of reasonable range in which the poverty line can lie. And if you look again historically, most societies, the poverty line is chosen so that something like 10%, maybe 20%. If you look and say in more developed countries, I would guess all the poverty lines that people have put up and that are discussed as being quite credible mean that we're having some proportion of the population, between 10 and 20% of the population, fall below the poverty line according to that definition. And if someone put up a poverty line which said 50% of the people in the UK are poor, it would just be thrown out because it's not sensible, it's not a credible value. And if people came up with a line which said only 2% are poor, again, it would be rejected. So there's a sense in which these methods, there's a lot of discretion in these methods, but at the end of the day, there's some constraints in the credible range. If one moves to the multi-dimensional, if you are trying to use either the social exclusion or the capability approach to get poverty scores or poverty status, what you really need to do is you've got to look at these different dimensions and you've got to decide very often where the cutoff is in each of these dimensions. So we've got an income or consumption score, we've got a health score, we've got a mobility score, whatever else, other items in there. And then we've got to judge to what extent are people poor on each of these criteria or each of these dimensions. And having decided that, then you've got to aggregate them together. So we have these two problems of, it doesn't really solve, this doesn't make it any easier, in fact it makes it more difficult because now we have some sort of poverty standard for each dimension and this problem about aggregating over dimensions. At the end of the day, we really have to have, certainly there's a great demand to try to have a poverty status indicator for each family, not just to have a list of different multiple set of dimensions. Of course, all of this is the next stage of problems I mentioned is to say, on top of this, even once we've gone through all these stages and decided how to determine the poverty status of some representative family, we then have this comparability problem. We've done the study for Rio, for a single person household in Rio, and we've decided how we're going to decide whether they're poor or not. But then we have to decide, we have to extend this to households of different sizes. We may want to take into account, once we've got households of different sizes, resource allocation issues within a household. This tends to be neglected, but there's certain societies in which we cannot assume that everyone in the household has the same living standard. So we may have a situation in which some people should be judged poor in a household while other people are non-poor, even within the same household. There's different environments. I think this is often very neglected. I mean, what do people need in terms of heating? Living in Finland, one is aware that heating is not just a discretionary item. In the winter, this is a necessity. You're going to freeze to death unless you have some heating. In other countries, that may not be a requirement, and therefore your needs are that much less. But of course, maybe it's so hot that you really need air conditioning to function properly. Or you may. So there's lots of environment issues which might be to do with climate, local public goods. Is there adequate local transport facilities that people can use? Do they need a car or can they use public transport? Are there parks available for people? Is the environment unhealthy? These sort of things can very much influence whether we judge someone is poor or not. Then there's variations in prices, very much to do, urban, rural distinctions, but in any large country you're going to get variations in the price level. I did some work on Russia a few years back where you get variations like the difference between the lowest price and the highest price regions in Russia is something like a factor of 5. And there are some very remote places in Siberia where the costs of a standard basket of goods might be 5 times what it costs in the cheapest region. So there's huge variations in regional prices there. We need to take those into account. Now, if we take each of these problems separately, then we might be able to say, I can solve that problem, I can solve that problem. But you can see that it's getting more and more complex, and at each of these stages, there's a lot of discretion involved. One of the, if we just take this local price issue, it's coming very much to a head this year because the World Bank has been doing the study of prices in different countries, and it's done it. It's much more detailed than the studies they've done before, and they've come to the conclusion that the so-called PPP, purchasing power parity calculations that they've done in the past are way out, and this has affected the poverty lines, the numbers for the poverty lines in different countries, and has affected the numbers of people judged to be poor. And this is not just a marginal change. We're talking about, I think, 200 million people in China fell below the poverty line according to the new PPP calculations. So this question about how you deal with, how you compare across different places to try to, where they face different sets of prices, is certainly a non-trivial exercise. And then there's, recently there's been quite a lot of interest in what I call here intertemporal variations or poverty dynamics. The fact that you might have a person, is it clear that they're poor when they're moving in and out of poverty over time? I mean, clearly there's some people that might be poor all the time, and maybe some people who are non-poor all the time, but there's other people who which various stages in their life cycle, or maybe even different times in the same year, if they're seasonal workers, they may be judged to be poor and non-poor. And what do we do about determining the poverty status of these people? How do we try to take into account these variations over time? So these are all what I would link as comparability issues, and as I say, one doesn't see a lot of discussion about those in the poverty literature, but I think they're very important. And then finally, of these 3 stages, there's the aggregation issues, where we try to take whatever it is we've done for poverty determination for individuals and combine these together to get a poverty number for the whole society. Now, some people might say, well, it's really just impossible to do that. We have to give up. But of course, that's not the way that the world works. The world works, politicians are out there asking for poverty numbers. They want to know whether, how poverty in Rio compares with Brasilia and the north of the country. They want to know whether poverty is going up and down over time. So if you just go along and say, well, it could be this or it could be that, you're not going to get very much of a response. There is a great demand for coming up with some particular number, at least for the purposes of comparing different regions and different household types, and for studying what happens over time. And I think we're obliged really to respond to that, even if the precise number that we come up with may be subject to a lot of hedging. So, but in order to get and this is again Amartya Sen's contribution to the aggregation issue. This is a very famous paper in Econometrica, which was to do with measuring poverty. And his main argument was the standard measure of measuring poverty is just what we call the headcount ratio, or sometimes called the poverty rate. We look to see how many people are judged to be poor. We take that proportion, we take that number as a proportion of the total population, so we say this percent of people are in poverty. But his objections to this is that if you take a poor person and give them money, it doesn't necessarily reduce the level of poverty. It reduces it if you give them enough poverty to take them out of poverty, but if you take a poor person, give them money, and they don't give them enough to move them up into the non-poverty group above the poverty line, then the number is unchanged. So it has this rather weak property, which is perhaps not what you would ideally like to see in an index. And so he was suggesting other measures, again, they're probably familiar with to a lot of you. First of all, the sort of poverty gap measure. So you ask yourself, what total amount of income, expenditure, or money do you need to raise all the poor people to the poverty line? Express that in some ratio. And the third type of distributionally sensitive measure, which takes into account distribution of incomes within the poverty group, which essentially says if someone is twice as far below the poverty line, then their degree of deprivation is more than twice the amount of someone who is intermediate. And nowadays people use these, the ones always used now in this Foster-Greer-Thorbecke family of poverty indices for the unidimensional case, the non-fuzzy case, where we can assign people to different groups. So that's where we are, but remember why I'm saying all this is because all of these, as I'm talking here, you think to yourself, there's all sorts of discretion here in what people do. There's all sorts of vagueness, uncertainty in the way that we characterize people, in the way that we extend our analysis to different population groups, and even in this aggregation here, this aggregation stage, there's ambiguity as to how we construct an overall measure of poverty. So the question which you might ask is, how do we deal with all of these different dimensions of uncertainty and vagueness? One simple way is to try alternative poverty lines. This is a standard way of perhaps adjusting or trying to see whether your methods are robust. So you could, for example, and this is quite common, use different poverty lines, one to measure poverty and one to measure extreme poverty. This is again quite commonly done in Latin America. So you might think of this as being poverty and destitution, some other term. The World Bank very often gives alternative calculations for global poverty based on $1 a day level and $2 a day. Again, it's just trying to reflect the fact that we may not be quite so sure about where the poverty line should be drawn, and therefore how many people are in these different groups. So one can do that, and I think that's a sensible way for researchers to go if they're worried about some of these issues. Another thing that people have done, in fact this was something which I got involved in about 20 years ago, I suppose, is to say that it's more in the constructing the aggregate measure and making comparisons over time, is to say, suppose that we have an index, let's just take a headcount ratio and look at the poverty rate. We're comparing 2 points in time. Now we might take one poverty line, and over time we might see that poverty fell. But it may be then that we take another poverty line, another reasonable value of the poverty line, and it's no longer the case that when we compute the numbers that the poverty rates fall, it may go up. What do we do in those circumstances? We may simply have to say it really is ambiguous. This poverty comparison over time, the poverty trend is not. We're not sure about this. So again, there's another element of fuzziness or vagueness here as to what's happened in the trend. And the poverty orderings, so it started off, this is a papers that James Foster and I did, where we ask ourselves, under what circumstances can we be sure that poverty has gone up or down? And under various slightly stronger conditions, you can say, if the distribution is changed in this particular way, then poverty has gone down unambiguously. It doesn't matter where you draw the poverty line. So we now have a criterion which is independent of where you draw the poverty line, and therefore really how large or small the particular poverty groups are. Other people have extended this to say, suppose we now differ, we have different researchers and we differ in the way that which poverty index we choose. Can we still, under what circumstances are there under which we can agree that poverty has gone up or down? Are there particular conditions that would allow us to draw those conclusions? And the answer is again yes. We need some dominance conditions. These are very much, again, those who know about these things, they're very much to do with first and second order dominance when you're comparing distributions. A third theme along these lines is when people say, when we have differences in household equivalent scales. I didn't mention this before, but there's a huge range of possibilities when you ask yourselves, how much does a two-person household need to be at the same living standard as a one-person household? Do they need twice as much income? Or do they need the same income? Or do they need 1.5 or 1.6 or 1.8 times as much income? How does one compare different household types to see what their living standards are? You find out that the equivalent scales, you can get quite a range of equivalent scale numbers. And again, we might ask ourselves, under what circumstances can we say that poverty is increased or decreased, independently of which equivalent scale that we choose? And then another way in which people have dealt with uncertainty and vagueness within the multi-dimensional case is to adopt various extreme cases. They might, for example, say, if we have a multi-dimensional indicators now, so each we're judging, we're trying to collect information on households under different headings. We might say a household is poor, definitely poor, if they're poor in every single dimension. This is, if you like, the intersection approach. Of course, this is a very strict criteria. We might weaken this and say, well, on the whole, we might judge a family to be poor if they're poor in 3/4 of their dimensions or half the dimensions. Of course, you could go right to the other extreme and say a person is poor if they're poor in just one of these dimensions, and that's the union approach. So we can deal with these, but of course this actually weakens our ability to make comparisons because we're not really sure. There's some degree of discretion again as to which of these different ways we do to solve this particular problem. So this is where really we get to in terms of why fuzzy approaches seem to offer at least a very attractive way of solving these problems. The crucial thing about the fuzzy approach is we no longer are required to have a crisp split between the poor group and the non-poor group. Again, the notion of a fuzzy set, I mean, usual sets in mathematics, either you're a member of the set or you're not a member of the set. That's the standard mathematical definition. The fuzzy sets have this, allow for this intermediate status where you might certainly be a member of the set, you may certainly be not a member of the set, but you may also have various degrees of membership, which is something in between, some intermediate status. And I think as soon as you come across this definition, you said poverty is a very obvious application of fuzzy sets, because it's very, I think everyone intuitively feels that there's lots of people that are very difficult to classify. There are some people that you could classify very easily as either poor, and other people that you could classify as being non-poor, but there's a lot of people who are in this intermediate category, and you might say, well, it really depends on what your view about poverty is, exactly how you approach it. So it's a very natural way of dealing, or at least trying to accommodate these vagueness and these uncertainties that I've discussed. So we then, we have a membership function. I leave it to other people to discuss this in more detail today. But the basic idea is we have a membership function now, which attaches to each person a number. That number is 1 if they are certain. Again, I have to be a bit careful about what term I use here. I use the word surely, because if I say certainly, it may have a probabilistic interpretation. That's something you want to avoid. So let's say if you're surely poor, your membership function is assigned a number 1, your membership function. If you're surely not poor, then you're assigned a number 0. And if you are somewhere in between, then you'll be assigned a number between 0 and 1. The applications of fuzziness to poverty have almost all, to my knowledge, been applied to the situation where we're trying to assign poverty status to people. So it's the identification problem where the fuzzy approach has been applied. But it is, in fact, also possible to consider having fuzzy orderings of various sorts of ways where you're not very sure whether poverty is increased or decreased, but it might have some intermediate ambiguous state in which you also might use fuzzy approaches. There's been some discussion of this, but more in the inequality comparisons area than in the poverty area. I just mentioned this, if you like, in passing. I don't know how I'm doing, but I'm not certain.
You're doing very well.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to be going on a huge amount longer, but let's just think about sitting down and asking yourselves, what is the various sources of fuzziness that we might use to construct our membership function? I don't know whether any of these, when I write down the list myself and think we're sitting in front of a data set. One way in which we might not be sure of someone's poverty status is because we haven't measured everything about the family in the data set that we're looking at. So we might say, it's a pity we didn't ask this question about this, because I think this would really tell us a lot about whether this family is poor or not. We sit in front of a household data set, we just see what the questions are, what the answers are. We've got to judge to ourselves, do we think this household is poor or not? But of course, so there may be cases in which we are uncertain, we're vague, because of an inability to ask all the questions. But that, in some senses, is not a very interesting source of fuzziness, because if that were the only problem, then we could really just design our surveys in more detail until we got all the information we got. But even if we're able to look into someone's, we knew everything we needed to know about this person, let's say even if we ask ourselves, we know everything about ourselves, can we always decide whether or not we should be judged to be in the poor or non-poor set? I think we would have to say we're not really, even if we knew everything, we wouldn't be able to make definitely a characterization. The problem with other people, of course, is that there are some unobserved things that we simply can't measure very well and might be very important in determining poverty status. For example, it strikes me that sometimes you get some people who are able to manage very well on very little resources. There are people who can you go into their kitchen and they can just bring out a few bits of vegetables and so on, and they can make a wonderful meal out of it. And other people that can't do this. And there are people who know exactly where they can buy the cheapest foods and how they can stretch their money. But we never capture this in a household survey. And yet, if we ask ourselves whether a family can really, because of course at the end of the day it's not just the resources they have, it's the ability to, the efficiency with which they use those resources that is missing. Then there's the problem that even if we didn't have a problem with either of those two things, we might have variations in the poverty lines that different individuals would choose. Some people might set a high value, some other people might set a low value. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence from these surveys which ask people to get an indication of what the poverty line is. They ask people like, what is the minimum amount of money you think you need to live on? That number, which some people have interpreted as a poverty line figure, is correlated with income. It's not completely proportional to income, but it certainly goes up with income. People who are better off tend to give a larger number to this, so that the interpretation is that they would set the poverty line higher than other individuals. So if that's the case, we may have individuals who might set different poverty lines, and that could give us some source of fuzziness in the way that we assign these membership functions to people. We might have, even for an individual, so there's variations across individuals, but even one person, if I ask any of you, say, what is the appropriate poverty line for a single person family in Rio in 2008, specify quite closely, it may be the case that you still say, well, I think it shouldn't be below this figure and it shouldn't be above this figure, but you might not. It may be very difficult to tie yourself down. We wouldn't really expect you to tie it down to a particular number. So there's uncertainty for individuals as well. So we could, in principle, I think, try to model all these things and try, in which case, come up with a way of assigning membership functions. And then if we move on to the multi-dimensional framework, we have another issue about how much weight we give to different dimensions. So again, people give different weights to health versus resources versus other dimensions. So if we start to say, if we try and recognize these different elements, it might be some way in which we would come up with a particular way of constructing a membership function. But there's quite a few problems, or at least questions, it seems to me, and I'm going to finish with really raising some of the questions so that you're aware that everything isn't quite cut and dried yet in this area. One is that there seems to be some ambiguity as to exactly what the membership value measures. Because there's ways of specifying this. We might say the membership value gives us the possibility of being poor. It's sometimes interpreted to be confidence in the statement that so you ask yourselves, how confident are you that this individual is poor? If I'm very confident, I give it 1. If I'm not confident, if I'm confident that they're not poor, I give it a value 0, and the measure in between measures my degree of confidence. The third interpretation is how close we have some idea of what an exemplar, an example of a poor family is. We have a notion about what they're doing with their lives, where they're living, how much resources they have. So we have that hour's example, and we're comparing another family with this prototypical poor person. And of course, they may have similarities in some dimensions and not similar in other dimensions, and we have to make a judgment as to how close they are. So we might imagine this is closeness in some space, in some n-dimensional space. The last possible interpretation is, you might say, it's the probability of being poor, but I'm sure everyone, all of the people that work seriously in this area don't like that at all. One reason they don't like it is because if you're talking about probabilities, you're almost saying, if we had enough information, we could resolve this probability and decide whether someone is poor or not poor. But the essence of the fuzzy approach is to say that's not possible. There is an inherent fuzziness which you cannot get rid of, regardless of how much information you collect on this person. So the probability, you cannot resolve it in the way that probabilistic statement might suggest. The third point I make here is that membership functions are essentially unidimensional because we just have a single number that we're assigning to people. So it's like a unidimensional poverty status, poverty assessment. But if we have lots of different dimensions that we're starting with, we've got to address this question about how you aggregate across dimensions. And again, people use various sorts of methods, but is it clear-cut? What are the criteria that one should use to decide what the membership function is? Or is it do we just come up with a solution to this problem, a practical solution, or is there an ideal method of aggregating it across dimensions? My fourth question here, how do we really go to a policymaker and explain what this concept means? And I work.
It might be a bit fuzzy.
Well, I know that, but if you say, they might think you're fuzzy as well as the concept. And this is important. I mean, I deal quite a lot. At the end of the day, we've got policymakers. We're trying to say, this is the way that you should analyse poverty. We should think of poverty as not in these clear-cut groups, but some intermediate groups. But it's not always, I think it's not the easiest thing to explain to people. I regard this as an unresolved issue. How we really explain to non-experts what we're doing here and what exactly the fuzziness in the membership function mean. And lastly here, when we go to the membership function, we appear to lose, when we have a single poverty line and a single unidimensional measure of resources, we not only have a way of characterizing whether people are poor or not, we also have a way of measuring how far they are below the poverty line, what their depth of poverty is. And we've lost that information in the membership function case. You might say, well, the further someone is away from the membership function of 1 is in some sense capturing the depth of poverty, but that's not very often. I don't think that interpretation is pursued very much. So the question, very often when we move to the fuzzy approach, almost everybody simply then adopts the fuzzy equivalent of the headcount ratio, and we lose all of the criticisms which were made by Sen about the headcount ratio are just forgotten, but they still seem to me to be relevant, and the question is how can we address that particular problem? So I hope I haven't really done very much in pushing forward the fuzzy poverty approach, but I hope to give you some idea about where it stands in the history of poverty analysis, and why it is potentially a very attractive way to go, but to what extent it may solve some of the problems of the past. It's not always clear that it's going to be the way of solving all of the problems, and clearly it relies still on quite a lot of work for people to develop this particular approach.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Shorrocks. Professor Shorrocks would take some questions from the audience. Would you like to get any questions? Carmen, please.
I'd like to take your observation about the usefulness of the concept in policymakers. How would you believe that they could use the concept of poverty in order to set the success of the policies to fight poverty? So that would be a kind of usefulness of the concept for them. Use that idea for you. I guess that the idea of measured poverty has a meaning of advocacy for policies to fight poverty. So the effort to better measure poverty should be associated to the idea that schools have better ways of
well, my own view here is that I don't think it makes a huge difference to the way that one evaluates policies. In fact, that may be another one of my unresolved questions here, is to say, what difference does it really make? If we're saying, let's take a particular example. Let's say we're looking at the Bolsa Familia, and we're asking ourselves, we're doing projections as to how successful has this been in reducing poverty, or what's the prospects for reducing poverty in the future. Would it make any difference if we adopted a fuzzy poverty approach from a more standard method? My guess is not really. I mean, I can't. The only way it would make a difference is if you thought a lot of people that were involved in this might be on the margins of poverty and therefore have this intermediate status. And that, for example, if you adopted the more traditional approach and set a very low poverty line, these people might not be judged to be poor to begin with, and therefore the successes in the program might be neglected. But as I said, one way of dealing with this is maybe to choose different poverty lines and just say, let's just test again how sensitive our results are to where we drew the poverty line, and that of course would accommodate this problem. So there might be different ways of the specific fuzzy approach may be one way of solving this, but there might be other ways of getting to the same sort of addressing the same sort of problem or the same question in a slightly different way by using other methods. Is that answering your question?
Just to follow the question, could we interpret the fuzzy membership as a degree of vulnerability of the person to poverty, in the sense, for instance, if you have another poverty line, you would have the same information, taking the fuzzy measure as the probability, not probability, but the degree of vulnerability of that person falling into poverty in a certain moment.
Well, you've opened another complete can of worms now. There's been quite a lot of work in the last 10 years on the concept of vulnerability and distinguishing it from poverty. In fact, there's two interpretations of vulnerability. One is the World Bank often use the term vulnerability to just say these are people who are not in poverty according to our definition, but they're on the margins of poverty, and therefore there's a good chance that they may fall into that state. There's other and more recognised method now is to say vulnerability refers to people who have quite a high chance of falling into poverty. So they may not be poor now, but they're vulnerable in the sense that we project into the future that they may fall into that particular state. So it's some expectations, and it's very much tied up with poverty dynamics. But it's not actually looking at, I mentioned poverty dynamics, so this is cases where we observe people jumping in and out of poverty, but we've collected the data on that. The vulnerability is always forward-looking in its sort of expectations. Now, of course, you could.
And for policymakers, this would be an important.
Well, I don't. It's just another. It would be another dimension. I didn't mention this, but I would just have to add it to my 6th or 7th in the list because I think it's one other. It's an additional way of saying there is some fuzziness here, but this is not. This is actually changing the notion of poverty from being whether people are poor either now or because of their historical record over some period to whether they're expected to be poor in the future. And then, of course, you could just redo the whole analysis, but in terms of expectations rather than actual measured observed events.
With respect to the first question, the first unresolved question, why don't we use the first point that we can have from the inequality measure? For example, we have a third point based on Gini coefficient, for example, and then we define the poor people and the non-poor people based on this third point. We define the non-poor people when if you give $1 to this guy, you increase inequality. You understand? And then poor people, this third point is the limit. When we are talking, about increase or not increase in inequality.
Well, I've never heard of that suggestion before, which is...
So each inequality measure, based on each inequality measure, we have a point, right? Tile, Gini, Shorrocks.
It's not just that, but you need... it depends on the distribution as well. It would depend on what is the income distribution of the rest of the population. It's not independent of that. I mean, for any particular measure, there's not a single sort of income level at which giving extra income to this person increases inequality. I mean, I hope people have, as I understand it, let me explain as a better. We take, I think the argument here is, we've got a population of individuals with just incomes. If we give $1 to a poor person, then inequality is going to be reduced. If we give it to a rich person, it may increase inequality. And somewhere in between, at some point in the distribution, there'll be an income level at which, if you give $1 to that particular person, it won't change, inequality won't change. But the level at which that happens will depend on what the incomes are in the rest of the population. And if we have a huge number of very poor people, you would expect, presumably, the switch point to be somewhat lower in the distribution.
I don't know if you are maybe probably you are right.
I think it won't. And it also depends on the inequality measure, but so there's two different factors there.
I only know that we calculate this to Brazil, and with Gini and Tile and Shorrocks and so on, Atkinson and other inequality index. And we, instead of use poverty line, we can use this cut point. And you say, oh, from this point up, these guys are non-poor.
Well, I may not have read, I haven't read everything that anyone's ever written on poverty, but I've never heard this being used as a way of trying to get an idea of where the poverty line is. And I'm not quite sure what the argument would be. So I don't know whether I can answer one way or the other.
Extend your work. The work is already there, probably.
Hoffman had the first chapter of this book recently released by EPEA about the decrease of inequality in Brazil. The first chapter is about this, Rodolfo Hoffman. He used two measures to determine the Gini coefficient and the type.
You may have problems of comparability among countries. Because, for instance, in a country where there are many poor individuals, this cut point could be very low, and so the percentage of poor people is low. Maybe in I don't know, in UK or in another European country, this cutoff is much higher, and you have maybe 30-40% of poor people. So you really have a problem of comparability and.
So I would retain an open mind of to do it.
In addition to Celia's comment, in addition to Celia's comment, and assuming that the membership function somehow reflects the vulnerability of being poor or coming below the poverty line, would it then be a measure for depth of poverty, the membership function? Because if you're if you're near to the poverty line, or crossing the poverty line into the not poverty area, then you would also be less vulnerable to being in the poor area.
Well, I go back and say there's a sense in which the membership number is often interpreted as being depth of poverty, but there's no obvious basis for this. And let me just reiterate again, I think if you introduce vulnerability here, I've got no problem with this, but it's just adding another dimension to the uncertainty and fuzziness of, which is saying now we're imagining poverty, the expectation of being poor in the future. It's just you're opening another can of worms, which may be a good example and maybe a good application, but it's not the one. People haven't really handled the vulnerability in the CRISP framework yet, so I'm not sure I really want to throw it into the fuzzy framework. There's again my gut feeling here is that we've got to be careful how we use the fuzzy approach, because it's not a sort of solution to everything. Just saying we have all this uncertainty, therefore once we've adopted the fuzzy approach everything is resolved. It's not the case. We have all the problems that's why I tried to explain them today. We have all of these sources of vagueness, uncertainties, and that the fuzzy, capturing it as a fuzzy membership function is a very natural, intuitively reasonable way of doing it, but problems are still there, and a lot of the problems just carry over to the fuzzy framework without being solved. So that's why I'm saying, yes, if we think of this distinction between poverty and vulnerability as being a problem in the CRISP framework, I think that's just going to carry over. It's not going to be somehow solved once we move to the fuzzy framework, although it may be another interesting application of that.
And that's another question, which is in response to that. If the depth of poverty is traditionally measured from income. How far are you away from $1 a day? Or, so is there no equivalent in the fuzzy framework for a fuzzy depth of poverty? Or how far are you from 1 or from 0? Is there such a measurement?
Well, it's quite easy. I mean, the obvious thing is to say you take the membership value and see how far this is from 1, and that or from 0, I suppose, and that indicates your depth of poverty. But that's not the interpretation. We're not interpreting it as in that way. And the other problem here is that the actual, when you're talking about depth of poverty, usually people think that it is proportionately increasing as you move away, as you drop below the poverty line. In other words, the depth of poverty is more than double if you double the distance from the poverty line. So it depends. We have a, I don't know whether we're talking about convex or concave function, but whichever one it is. But of course, usually the way that people draw the fuzzy membership functions is that it's neither convex. It's convex in one part of it, concave in the other, and therefore it can't satisfy this particular condition. So we have, I'm not sure. That's why I'm raising it here. That is to say that I don't know how we construct depth of poverty question. However, what I didn't mention is, but 10 years ago I wrote a paper, which has not been published, but it is listed in Google Scholar seems to find all sorts of things. That this is a paper which I wrote, was never issued as a discussion paper, and I've never circulated it, but it's up there on Google Scholar as cited. But it asked this question about, we have our CRISP, our Foster-Greer-Thorbecke type poverty indices, which have been devised for the CRISP framework. Can these be extended? What are the equivalent functions in the fuzzy framework? And this particular paper said it's possible, if you specify certain conditions, every CRISP poverty index has a unique extension to the fuzzy framework. So that this would allow you not just to take the headcount ratio, but to take the poverty gap measure and the squared poverty gap measure, and you would be able to find out what the equivalent fuzzy index was. So it would in fact solve this problem without necessarily, presumably somehow in there it solves this problem without measuring depth of poverty, but it doesn't do it directly. It does it in this indirect way of simply saying these are the indices that you should use in the fuzzy framework, and as I recall, the standard properties of the CRISP poverty index carry over to the fuzzy framework. I didn't mention it today, partly because it's a technically very difficult paper, and I never felt very happy. I set it aside to work on it, and still haven't managed to get down to it. Okay.
It's about how do I choose the variables. For example, do you think that it's important to divide poverty and welfare for some groups? Because if we think about households, water, employment, energy, and so on. But maybe computer, I don't know, if computer should be a good variable for poverty, maybe for welfare. And car and so on. What do you think about that?
Well, again, you're asking a question which people in the poverty analysis have asked for a very long time. How do you take different dimensions, and what sort of weights do you give them? How much do you assign to different things? Of course, we might have a particular list which we think is particularly associated with poverty, and other things which we're not sure about. Let me take computers are one example, but let me take televisions. because I've been... Now, if you did this analysis 40 years ago, would you think that you asked people whether they had a television? Now, at that time, if you didn't have a television, it wouldn't necessarily mean that you were poor, because not many people had televisions, and if you didn't have it, lots of people who could have had television didn't have it because there wasn't really interesting programs to watch. Now, of course, as ownership of televisions became more pronounced, the fact that someone didn't have a colour television, or perhaps didn't have a colour television, would have been more of an indicator of poverty. So, in some sense, people have tried to deal with this in practice by looking at what is the percentage of people who have this particular item. If not many people have it, then not having it isn't really an indicator of poverty. But if a lot of people have it, not having it may be an indicator of poverty. The problem there is when you get to a point by why is it people do not have television? Of course, nowadays it's so cheap, at least in developed countries. But if people don't have a television, it's usually because they've chosen not to have a television, not because they can't afford it. So it's no longer an indicator of poverty, because the reasons why people don't have televisions is not related to whether they're poor or not. But you can say, the same for a lot of other items. I mean, we're talking about consumer durables. I mean, do people have dishwashers? Some people don't have dishwashers because their kitchen is a bit small for a dishwasher, so they choose not to have it. So it's quite tricky, I think, to just look to the data to answer that particular question. But people certainly have tried on this. I'm not a great expert on how to deal with this particular question, but it's just one of many questions in how you tease out the information you require from the data that you're given.
Taking this question of the television, people who don't have television because they don't want to have their lifestyle. Okay. So the problem, and we would like the question we would like to raise is if those people had the option to buy a television and decided not to, and they had the opportunity. So I'm looking at the capability test. But generally, when we try to approach the capability test, we ask information about functioning. In this case, people who watch TV or have access to TV. How do we solve this methodologically, this problem?
Well, how would we in practice? I mean, one way we could solve this is to try to ask questions about what people feel. I mean, so you could ask them, you don't have a television set, how do you feel about that? And you would simply say, I wish I had one, or I don't care because I don't want to waste my time watching the television, or all the television programs are rubbish.
These people suffer from cheap preferences. They would say, well, I don't want, because probably he doesn't want because he cannot get one. Very typical poor environment that people, according to
they justify the fact that they don't have these. I don't know whether this. I think that's just bad questionnaire design. I think if you ask the right sort of questions, you can get people to answer those questions. Given that we ask much more difficult questions than that, I don't see that as being an overriding problem.
Yes, but if this is the case, the problem is not enough information, not a theoretical problem.
Yeah.
Because in case of full information, you can define the person who does really want the car because the person lives in London. So this person is really not poor from his point of view.
But when you take this to logical conclusion, you ask yourself, what actual questions could you ask which really are decisive in determining whether someone's poor or not? It's not easy, is it? Because I do know that the original Townsend, I mentioned that Peter Townsend, the sociologist, was the one who happened to, I think, pioneer a lot of these social exclusion work, and he did this at my old university, and I wrote a book review of the book when it came out. And I mean, it was a valiant attempt, but the sort of questions he tried to ask to see whether people were poor or not, or things like, do you eat meat more than 3 times a week? As if you didn't eat meat, it was because you couldn't afford to eat meat. But of course, as we're quite aware, there's a lot of people who don't eat meat because they're vegetarians or because they just, it doesn't really appeal to them. So we didn't get that sort of question. Then he asked questions about holidays. Do you take a vacation? Well, some people don't take a vacation because they can't afford it, but other people might not take a vacation for other sorts of reasons. And when you look through each of the questions he was asking, there was always a valid reason why people may not be scoring very high on this particular dimension. And then you say, well, don't worry, because we're only going to look at people who score a lot, and it's very unlikely, but it's not impossible. You're going to pick up some people vegetarians who don't watch the television and so on, and just enjoy it. They could score very badly on all of these things, and I suppose you could say, well, this is just reinforcing our notion of fuzziness here, that we can get people who don't do very well, but in fact we're misclassifying them. Do you have one?
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you.